The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
I'm Amber Bell, and this is Real Agriculture. Here today for an episode of Canola School with Lori Yarnell, who's a technical marketing manager with BASF. And we're going to be talking about Sclerotinia, but we're going to really break that down. We're going to talk about what happened last year.
For sure.
Because last year was a different experience, I think, for a lot of growers. So let's go into a couple of the stories that you guys heard from growers. You know, what were we seeing?
Yeah, so last year, it was the first year of moisture for a lot of areas after a lot of years of drought. And I know going into 2024, there was a lot of talk of, is the inoculum even there anymore? After so many years of drought, we know that sclerotia, the resting bodies that overwinter in the soil, are supposed to last for 10 plus years. But would those populations be low enough that even if we had the right conditions, that Sclerotinia would show up? What we learned is, yes, they were there. They were there indeed. That especially in Manitoba, I know the northeast central areas of Saskatchewan had a lot of Sclerotinia pressure last year. You can see that just from stories that we're hearing from our growers and some regrets on not spraying fungicide. But hearing that despite the drought, pressure was there. So I think that's a big lesson that we learned is, hey, even if we've had years of drought, we know the pathogen's there, and if conditions return to having moisture in June and July, that the disease will show up.
Right, and how important is that to consider going into the season for growers? You know, okay, it's really dry right now. We're doing pretty well without too much rainfall. So how important is that to know going into the season when you're making your plans?
I think it is important to know that the disease is there. When we really need to start looking at moisture and whether we need a fungicide to help control Sclerotinia is going to be in that window about 2 weeks prior to flowering. That last year, for example, once again going to lessons from 2024, we had a really wet June across a lot of the prairies, and then the taps turned off for July in a lot of areas. But I think because it was so wet in June, the Wunsch lab at NDSU down in North Dakota has showed that the biggest indicator of pathogen of the sclerotia germinating, creating apothecia, having those spores present is prolonged moisture. So if those 2 weeks before flowering, if the soil is consistently wet, that's really going to allow the pathogen to create those spores and be present at flowering. So if that timing before flowering is really wet and really has that prolonged soil moisture, it's going to increase your risk of Sclerotinia. And I think last year, with the taps turning off and not having that rain in July, probably a lot of growers thought, oh, not raining, don't need to worry about Sclerotinia. But we saw that with that wet June, we had really dense canola crops and a lot of moisture in that soil that despite it not raining, that moisture is trapped in the canopy, creating that microclimate in the canopy where there's still moisture, still humidity. I know talking to my family last year in Manitoba that despite it not having rained for 2 weeks, you still can't mow your lawn until the afternoon, right? That there's so much moisture in the soil, in the ground, in that canola canopy that despite it not having rained for a while, the moisture's there to really still have disease.
And how much disease incidence is almost too much? Like, at what point is it like, hey, last year, you know, there was just a bit. Yeah. Should you be worried about it this year?
Yeah. So there's a handy calculation that looks at incidence. Incidence being the number of plants infected. So for every point incidence, you're losing about half a point of yield. So if you have 10% incidence, 1 in every 10 plants infected, you're losing about 5% of your yield. So depending on what your yield potential's looking like, that can really factor into kind of what percentage does it give you that ROI to spray. Unfortunately, the conditions where your yield potential looks really good, you have that dense canopy, lots of vegetation, lots of moisture, that's also the conditions that you're generally going to see disease. So when we have the conditions that your canola crop's looking good, it's that much more important to protect that yield potential.
Right, and so a fungicide's important if you're concerned about it. But are there any other strategies that growers can use to kind of mitigate some of the risk?
I think a big one is planting the correct crop density, that we don't want a really tight canopy, that trying to aim for that 5 to 7 plants per square foot, I believe it is, that correct plant density at the beginning of the season is something we can do now. I guess the plants already are popping out of the ground for a lot of Western Canada, so maybe a little late for this year.
Plan for next year.
But plan for next year of having that correct density of plants. And then if conditions are looking good, especially that time leading up to flowering, as well as at that flowering timing, spraying a fungicide is going to be your best option. Unfortunately, by the time you see disease, it's too late. That by the time we're seeing those infections, it's too late to spray. So really, it's looking at the conditions that we have leading up to flowering, at flowering, that's really going to inform our management decisions for the year.
Great, and any words of encouragement for growers as we go into this growing season?
Yeah, we never know what the year is going to throw at us. And moisture, it's a good problem to have, right? That if we're having that moisture, to have that dense canopy, to have disease conditions, we know that the yield potential's there. So let's hope for a return to average moisture again this year across the prairies.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining us. And that was Lori Yarnell on Real Agriculture.